By the mid-19th century, the United States was experiencing a period of rapid growth and deep social contradictions. The Industrial Revolution, mass urbanization, and waves of European immigration were transforming the country. Cities were growing faster than schools, hospitals, and housing could be built. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were crowded with factories, docks, and the tenements of the poor. On the streets of these metropolises, a new phenomenon emerged. Thousands of homeless children left without adult supervision. By the 1850s, New York City, according to police and city council estimates, had between 10,000 and 30,000 street children. These were orphans, children of impoverished families and immigrants who had lost work or parents to disease. The cholera epidemic of 1849 alone claimed over 5,000 lives in Manhattan, leaving hundreds of children without parents. In 1853, the New York Times reported, "Along the sidewalks of Bowery and Chatham Street swarm children in tattered clothes. They sell newspapers, shine shoes, steal apples, and sleep in boxes. This is the new generation of the city, street children." Society did not know how to handle them. Orphanages were overcrowded, and juvenile prisons housed children alongside adult criminals. In correctional colonies, children faced corporal punishment and heavy labor. Authorities often saw them as a threat to public order rather than as victims of social circumstances. One of the first to view these children not as criminals but as a tragedy was Charles Loring Brace, a young Protestant minister and social reformer, Yale graduate and member of the social gospel movement. He believed poverty and crime could be overcome not through punishment, but through opportunity. In 1853, Brace founded the Children's Aid Society, dedicated to giving homeless children a chance at a new life far from the slums on the American frontier, where farmers needed labor. Brace wrote in his journal, "I have seen boys sleeping under bridges, girls selling matches, infants left at church doors. These children are not criminals. They are the future, abandoned to fate." He believed rural life cultivated diligence, honesty, and faith, whereas the city corrupted. Inspired by Christian humanitarian ideas, he proposed a system to relocate orphans to families on farms in the Midwest. This initiative would later become known as the Orphan Train Movement. The first train departed New York on September 28, 1854, carrying 46 children, boys and girls aged 6 to 15. The journey stretched over 1,000 miles to Michigan. Each stop was announced in local newspapers, inviting residents to the station to receive a child into a Christian household. The selection process was almost theatrical. Children lined up on the platform while farmers and their wives inspected them, asked questions, and made their choice. Some were taken immediately, others had to wait for the next train. Contemporaries described the scene with conflicting emotions. The New York Daily Tribune reported, "It is a touching and strange sight. Children who do not know what awaits them, looking at the crowd with hope and fear. Some find a home, others simply disappear." For Brace, this embodied his dream. For critics, it was a dangerous social experiment. The idea, however, was in demand. Over the next several years, the Children's Aid Society established regular trains. From 1854 to 1929, historians estimate that 200,000 to 250,000 children were transported from the East Coast to central and western states, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, Texas, and others. Not all these children were literal orphans. Some impoverished families voluntarily gave their children away, hoping they would have better lives on farms. A letter from a mother published in The Sun in 1861 read, "If my son will be fed and able to work, I will bless those who take him. Here in the city, he will perish." Initially, the program was seen as an act of Christian charity. Soon, however, troubling reports emerged. There was no system for monitoring foster families. Children often became farm laborers, working 10-12 hours a day with no access to education. Some were abused or ran away. Official reports indicated that around 20% of relocated children disappeared from records. Despite this, the movement continued to grow. Catholic organizations such as the New York Foundling Hospital, Sisters of Charity, and the Boston Home for Little Wanderers followed suit. Each had its own routes, supervisors, and traveling agents. Trains departed several times a year. Children were sent with a small bundle of clothing and a tag listing only their name and age. Over time, orphan trains became a familiar part of American life. Orchestras welcomed them at stations, churches held prayers, and newspapers published heartwarming stories of adopted boys who became respectable citizens. Yet official statistics revealed that about half the children were never legally adopted, merely placed without legal protection or follow-up. Historians today call this era an age of social experimentation under the guise of charity. The idea of relocating children coincided with American expansionist ideology, the belief in the civilizing mission and the right to bring progress to the West. Orphan trains were part of this broader pattern. The country was settling new territories, populating empty farms, building railroads, and simultaneously relocating human lives. By the late 19th century, after Brace's death in 1890, his followers, including E.P. Smith and George McPherson, took over the YO movement. They attempted to introduce a system of inspectors to visit children and file reports. But until the 1920s, there was no state oversight as we understand it today. Public awareness grew alongside the movement. Reformers such as Louisa May Alcott and Jane Addams advocated for children's courts and schools where poor children could receive education rather than simply be distributed. Newspapers began reporting tragic cases. In 1902, the Chicago Tribune published The Lost Boys of Iowa, recounting dozens of children who had fled foster families and lived on the streets of Des Moines. Yet the program also had genuine successes. Many children found loving families, received education, and grew into teachers, doctors, and farmers. Historian Marilyn Holt, in The Orphan Trains, Placing Out in America, 1992, wrote, "The orphan train movement was at once an expression of humanitarianism and an example of the era's dangerous overconfidence. It saved thousands, but left wounds that have not healed to this day." By the 1920s, the situation changed. The first state social welfare services, juvenile courts, and foster care programs were established. The last official orphan train ran in 1929, replaced by a new model of legal oversight and child welfare. Yet the legacy of the movement remains. Scholars estimate that today about 2 million Americans could trace ancestry to children transported on orphan trains. By the mid-20th century, orphan train riders associations emerged, former participants sharing their stories and seeking recognition. The history of orphan trains began with a sincere desire to save children, but evolved into one of the most controversial social experiments in U.S. history. It remains a mirror of its era, a time when faith in progress and religious duty intersected with ignorance, prejudice, and the absence of laws capable of protecting the most vulnerable. The orphan train movement, beginning in the mid-1850s, rapidly became a central mechanism for addressing the overwhelming presence of homeless children in eastern cities. At its core, the movement combined humanitarian intentions with logistical rigor, creating a complex system for relocating tens of thousands of children across the United States. Yet behind the hopeful veneer lay profound challenges and frequent suffering. The first step in this process occurred in orphanages and charitable institutions along the East Coast. Children ranging from 6 to 15 were housed in the facilities of organizations such as the Children's Aid Society in New York, the New York Foundling Hospital, and Boston's Home for Little Wanderers. These institutions were crowded. Census records from the 1860s indicate that in New York alone, orphanages collectively housed over 5,000 children at any given time. Children were often sick, malnourished, and traumatized by the loss of parents or abandonment. In the orphanages, staff compiled meticulous lists of the children eligible for relocation. Reports included age, gender, health conditions, skills, and occasionally notes on personality or religious affiliation. Letters were written to potential families in the Midwest, and local newspapers published notices seeking adoptive households. According to a report in the New York Tribune from 1872, these lists frequently emphasized the children's potential as farm laborers. These boys and girls are hardy, willing to work, and prepared for life upon the soil. They are to be placed with Christian families capable of providing guidance and sustenance. Once selected, children were assigned to specific trains. These trains were not luxurious conveyances. They were standard passenger cars adapted to carry children and accompanying supervisors. Social workers, clergy members, and volunteers, sometimes called train matrons or child guides, accompanied the children for the duration of the journey. Their responsibilities included maintaining order, documenting placements, and intervening when disputes arose. Historical records reveal that one supervisor could be responsible for 30 to 50 children per train, a challenging task given the long journeys and the children's emotional states. The journeys themselves could last several days to weeks, depending on the distance. Trains typically traveled from New York or Boston through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, eventually reaching Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, or Minnesota. Stops were scheduled in towns along the route where local families, often notified weeks in advance through church bulletins and newspaper advertisements, could come to select children. At each stop, children were presented in groups on the platforms, a scene simultaneously described as hopeful and unsettling by contemporary observers. Documentation from the Children's Aid Society archives illustrates the tension inherent in these events. One 1875 report reads, "Children assembled at the depot looked apprehensive and weary. Families arrived with curiosity and caution. Some children were embraced instantly, others lingered, uncertain of their fate." The train's journey continued, leaving behind both sorrow and relief. Selection was often arbitrary. Families could ask questions about a child's age, health, or temperament, but there were no standardized assessments to ensure the child's safety or compatibility. Some children were chosen immediately, others remained on the train for subsequent stops, waiting days in a foreign environment. The process, while well-intentioned, placed children in a precarious position with little agency over their own destinies. Alongside the logistical challenges, dangers abounded. Children traveled hundreds of miles, sometimes across harsh terrain, and were subject to disease, exhaustion, and exposure. Supervisors recorded instances of illness. Influenza, measles, and smallpox were not uncommon, and occasionally deaths occurred during transport. The Children's Aid Society Annual Report of 1881 notes, "Despite careful supervision, the journey cannot be without risk. We grieve to report several children succumbed to illness, and measures have been implemented to improve sanitation and medical care." Children's experiences upon arrival were equally varied. Some were received by caring, devout families who integrated them fully, providing food, shelter, and schooling. Others faced severe labor exploitation, domestic abuse, or neglect. Many boys were expected to work long hours plowing fields or tending livestock, while girls were employed in household labor. Historical accounts reveal that about 20% of the relocated children either ran away or disappeared from records, illustrating the limitations of oversight in an otherwise ambitious program. Despite these hardships, contemporary newspapers frequently framed the trains in a positive light. The Chicago Tribune in 1885 described the trains as a conveyance of salvation, emphasizing the opportunity for children to escape urban squalor and contribute to the development of the Midwest. Yet, archival correspondence, letters written by children years later, paints a more nuanced picture. One former participant recalled in a 1912 letter, "I was taken from the streets of New York to a farm in Iowa. The family fed me and gave me a bed, but I worked from dawn until dark. I learned many skills, but I also lost my name, my friends, and the city I called home." Statistical records underscore the scale of the operation. From 1854 to 1929, roughly 400 separate orphan train journeys transported children across at least 20 states. Children ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, with a slight majority being boys. The median age was 10. Researchers note that the demographic profile reflected not only urban poverty, but also broader societal forces: immigration, epidemic disease, and the lack of social welfare structures. In addition to logistical and personal challenges, the program faced legal and ethical scrutiny. Critics labeled the orphan trains as a form of child labor trafficking, disguised as charity. While the Children's Aid Society sought to ensure moral and religious guidance, oversight was minimal. Town records and census data from the 1870s show gaps in reporting. Children sometimes changed households multiple times, with few mechanisms for follow-up or accountability. Despite these controversies, the orphan trains represented a unique blend of social reform, religious mission, and frontier expansion. They addressed a critical urban crisis, tens of thousands of homeless children, and simultaneously supplied labor to sparsely populated farming regions. For many children, these trains were indeed trains of hope, providing shelter, sustenance, and opportunity. For others, they were trains of despair, exposing them to harsh labor, loss of identity, and enduring trauma. By the early 20th century, the orphan train movement had inspired other initiatives in the United States and even influenced Canadian child relocation programs. The legacy of this system is preserved not only in historical archives, but also in personal testimonies collected by scholars and descendants of orphan train riders. The complexity of the program, its successes and its failures, reflects the broader tensions of American society at the time, the intersection of benevolent intent, economic necessity, and the vulnerability of the most powerless. Upon arrival in towns and farms across the Midwest, orphan train children faced a reality far more complex than the rosy visions described by reformers. While organizations such as the Children's Aid Society and the Home for Little Wanderers intended to provide safe homes, education, and moral guidance, the actual experiences of children were diverse and often harsh. Children ranging from 6 to 15 years old were greeted by prospective foster families at train stations, church halls, or town centers. The selection process, designed for efficiency, was often public and hurried. Children were lined up on platforms, clutching small bundles containing their belongings, while families and neighbors examined them. Supervisors documented each child's destination, age, and health, but follow-up was inconsistent, and many children were never visited again by the organization, For some children, these new homes represented genuine opportunity. Letters and memoirs from former riders describe families who welcomed them, providing food, clothing, shelter, and schooling. A 1905 diary entry from a boy relocated from New York to Iowa reflects this experience. They fed me, gave me a bed, and sent me to the local school. I learned to read and write, and felt part of a family for the first time. The farm work was hard, but I was not alone. Yet many others faced severe challenges. Rural families often relied on the children as a source of labor, expecting them to work long hours in the fields, tend livestock, or perform household chores, sometimes exceeding 12 hours per day. Archival case files from the Children's Aid Society include letters of complaint, such as an 1887 Nebraska submission. The boy we received from the train works from sunrise to sunset and is given little food. He sleeps in the barn and is often beaten. We ask for guidance in correcting this situation. The risk of exploitation was compounded by minimal oversight. Supervisors could only document conditions briefly during train stops or correspondence. Reports indicate that 20 to 30% of children experienced significant hardship, ranging from neglect to outright abuse. Some children ran away multiple times, leading to additional challenges for both the children and the authorities. Psychological consequences were equally profound. Many children lost their birth names, replaced by new ones given by foster families. This renaming, while sometimes intended to symbolize a fresh start, often severed connections with their identities and past relationships. One former rider recounted, "They called me Mary now, not my birth name. I tried to remember who I was, but it faded. I did my work. I learned manners, but a part of me was left on the train that brought me here." Education opportunities varied greatly. In some towns, children attended one-room schoolhouses alongside local children, while in more remote areas, education was minimal or non-existent. Tasks such as cooking, cleaning, plowing fields, and tending animals frequently took precedence over schooling. According to a 1910 Children's Aid Society report, while the goal of intellectual training remains central, practical labor often limits attendance and progress. Supervisors must negotiate between the child's welfare and the economic reality of farm life. Religion played a central role in assimilation. Families often required children to attend church services and follow strict moral codes. Many children, particularly those of immigrant backgrounds, experienced the suppression of cultural and linguistic traditions. Letters from Irish and German children document feelings of alienation and identity loss as they adjusted to Protestant-dominated communities in Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota. Real cases illustrate both the positive and negative outcomes. For instance, the case of Anna O'Malley, an Irish immigrant child sent to a farm in Illinois in 1878, shows successful adaptation. She integrated into the family, learned farming and domestic skills, and later became a school teacher, sending letters back to younger children in New York with advice and encouragement. Conversely, Jacob Weiss, a German immigrant relocated to Kansas in 1882, ran away 3 times due to abuse and overwork, before eventually finding refuge in an urban settlement house. Despite hardships, many children developed resilience. Diaries, letters and interviews collected decades later reveal a common theme. Early adversity taught skills, independence, and perseverance. Former riders frequently described how these formative experiences shaped their work ethic, problem-solving, abilities, and sense of responsibility in adulthood. One former boy wrote in 1920, "I learned to work hard and take care of myself. The world is harsher than I imagined, but I survived. I owe that, in part, to the orphan train." Social interactions also shaped experiences. Some communities welcomed the children, seeing them as contributors to local labor needs. Others were suspicious, viewing them as outsiders competing for resources or disrupting local hierarchies. Conflicts occasionally arose between adopted children and foster siblings or neighbors, highlighting the tensions inherent in the program. For older children, the challenges were particularly acute. Adolescents were expected to conform to adult labor standards with limited autonomy or choice. Some resisted, running away, hiding, or resisting instructions. Children placed at younger ages sometimes adjusted more readily, but struggled with long-term identity issues. The Children's Aid Society attempted to maintain contact through letters and occasional visits, but by the late 19th century, the sheer scale of relocations made consistent supervision impossible. The legacy of orphan train placements is complex. For some, it opened doors to stable households, education, and meaningful careers. For others, it brought physical hardship, emotional trauma, and permanent disconnection from family origins. The duality of outcomes, opportunity, intertwined with suffering, reflects the broader contradictions of social reform in an industrializing nation. Historian Marilyn Holt notes, "The children were simultaneously objects of philanthropy and labor commodities. Their lives illustrate the paradox of social reform in an industrializing nation. Ultimately, the orphan train created a new reality for thousands of children, a life that promised safety and opportunity, yet frequently demanded labor, conformity, and emotional endurance. Some thrived, some struggled, and some disappeared from historical records entirely." The program's mixture of humanitarianism, economic expediency, and cultural assimilation left lasting marks on the lives of participants and on the communities that received them. The orphan train movement, through its successes and failures, demonstrates the complexity of child welfare in a nation balancing moral intention with practical realities. These children's experiences of adaptation, survival, and enduring psychological impact reveal the nuanced human story behind one of America's largest social experiments, illustrating both the promise and peril of well-meaning intervention. By the early 20th century, many former orphan train children had reached adulthood, carrying with them memories of a childhood uprooted and transplanted across the American landscape. While the orphan trains had ceased operation by 1929, the stories of those who rode them did not disappear. Decades later, former riders began to speak, write, and organize, providing historians and the public with insights into the human consequences of the movement. The first formal efforts to collect these narratives emerged in the mid-20th century. In 1940, the National Orphan Train Historical Society began conducting interviews with surviving riders, documenting their recollections of trains, families, and communities. These interviews reveal a spectrum of experiences. Some children remembered warmth, safety, and opportunity. Others recounted neglect, labor exploitation, and loss of identity. A woman named Ethel Cohen, who rode a train from New York to Minnesota, in 1910 described her arrival. "The farm was strange, the family strict, and I didn't know the language or the customs. I worked long hours, and the days were lonely, but I was fed and clothed. I survived, though it changed who I was." Letters and diaries from former riders offer similarly nuanced perspectives. One man, Samuel Green, relocated to Iowa at age 9, wrote in 1925, "I never forgot the day we left New York. The train was crowded, noisy, and frightening. I missed my sister and the streets I knew. The family that took me treated me kindly, but I was not their child. I had to become someone else to live." These first-hand accounts highlight recurring themes: displacement, adaptation, resilience, and the struggle to reconcile past and present identities. Many riders describe a duality: gratitude for survival and opportunity, yet lingering sorrow for lost childhoods and broken family connections. As stories accumulated, former riders began organizing themselves. By the 1970s, associations such as the Orphaned Train Riders National Reunion provided platforms for former participants and their descendants to share experiences. These gatherings fostered collective memory, offered mutual support, and enabled families to trace ancestral connections. Participants often brought photographs, train tickets, letters, and other artifacts, creating living archives of personal and communal history. Historians and sociologists have extensively analyzed these narratives. Marilyn Holt, author of The Orphan Trains, Placing Out in America, emphasized that while the movement was grounded in humanitarian goals, it also embodied systemic vulnerabilities. Children were simultaneously rescued and commodified. Their survival depended on the moral character of the receiving families and the oversight of the agencies, which was uneven at best. Archival records support these findings. The Children's Aid Society maintained detailed logs, including departure manifests, placement records, and letters from supervisors documenting progress or concerns. For example, an 1883 entry from supervisor Mrs. Clara Barton, not the nurse, but a field agent, noted, "Many children thrive in their new homes. Others struggle with the work and expectations. We have instituted follow-up visits, but the sheer number of placements overwhelms our capacity." Recognition of the orphan train's historical significance accelerated in the late 20th century. Museums and historical societies, particularly in Iowa, Nebraska, and New York, curated exhibits featuring photographs, letters, and artifacts. The National Orphan Train Museum in Concordia, Kansas, opened in 2002, preserving not only the tangible history of the trains, but also the personal stories of riders. Visitors can view original train schedules, boarding manifests, and clothing worn by children, connecting physical artifacts to human experiences. International comparisons further contextualize the orphan trains. Canada, for instance, developed similar child relocation programs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, such as the Home Children program, which sent children from British orphanages to farms in Canada. Scholars note parallels. Both programs aim to address urban poverty and supply labor to rural regions, yet often expose children to exploitation and identity loss. Comparisons underscore that the orphan train movement was part of a broader transatlantic approach to child welfare, shaped by contemporary notions of morality, work, and assimilation. The voices of former riders also contributed to a re-evaluation of the movement's ethical implications. In oral history projects conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, participants reflected on the tension between opportunity and suffering. One man, Henry Lutz, who had been relocated to Nebraska, recounted, "I was given food, a roof, and work, but I never forgot my mother or my first home. I learned to survive, to obey, to fit in, but part of me remained on the train." Such narratives illuminate the duality of the orphan train experience. It was both a lifeline and a profound social experiment. The voices preserved in interviews, letters, and reunions ensure that the memories of these children, once nearly invisible in the historical record, remain central to understanding this chapter of American history. As awareness grew, descendants of orphan train riders began tracing genealogies, publishing memoirs, and contributing to documentaries, ensuring intergenerational recognition. Educational initiatives incorporate these stories into curricula, highlighting the intersections of social reform, child welfare, immigration, and labor history. By connecting individual experiences to broader social political, and economic contexts, historians have transformed orphan train narratives from isolated anecdotes into a comprehensive understanding of American childhood, migration, and reform. The voices of the past, preserved through letters, diaries, interviews, and reunions, continue to illuminate both the promise and the peril of a movement that reshaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of children. In reflecting upon these stories, scholars emphasize lessons for contemporary child welfare, the importance of oversight, the recognition of children's agency, and the ethical responsibility to balance humanitarian goals with protection and respect for the individual. The orphan train movement, once a practical response to urban poverty, now serves as a historical touchstone, a reminder of resilience, vulnerability, and the enduring impact of social policy on human lives. By the late 1920s, the orphan train movement had ceased operation, its final journey departing New York in 1929. Over 75 years, the program had transported an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 children from the crowded urban tenements of the East Coast to rural communities across the Midwest and beyond. Its legacy is complex, reflecting a combination of humanitarian ambition, social experimentation, and ethical controversy. The immediate impact on the children was profound. For many, relocation provided basic survival, regular meals, clothing, shelter, and protection from the squalor and violence of urban streets. Some thrived in their new homes, acquiring skills and education that would allow them to pursue careers in teaching, medicine, farming, and business. Former rider memoirs frequently describe gratitude for opportunities that would have been unattainable in their original urban environments. One woman recalled, "I became part of a family that gave me a chance to live, to work, and to learn. I will always be grateful for the life I built there." Yet the program also produced lasting challenges. Children were removed from their families, sometimes against their will, and assigned new identities in unfamiliar environments. Many endured labor exploitation, long working hours, and strict moral regimes. Letters and oral histories reveal persistent emotional consequences, including identity loss, trauma from separation, and ongoing struggles to reconcile past and present. Approximately 20–30% of relocated children experienced severe hardship, highlighting the uneven protection and oversight inherent in the program. The societal legacy of the orphan trains is equally significant. Communities across the Midwest were shaped by the influx of orphan train children whose labor contributed to farm development and local economies. In many towns, these children became integrated into families and neighborhoods, influencing demographic patterns and social networks for generations. Historical records indicate that descendants of orphan train riders today number in the millions, forming a living legacy that continues to connect urban origins with rural settlement patterns. Historians and social scientists have analyzed the movement as both a humanitarian initiative and a social experiment. Marilyn Holt's research emphasizes the dual nature of the trains. The orphan trains were a response to immediate need, yet they also reflected systemic inequities. Children were saved from poverty, but the program relied on minimal oversight and assumed compliance from receiving families. Archival documents demonstrate the scope of the operation. Placement records, train manifests, and letters from supervisors show meticulous organization, yet also gaps in monitoring and accountability. While agencies such as the Children's Aid Society made efforts to follow up, the vast number of children placed over decades meant that many were never formally documented after relocation. The ethical implications of the orphan trains continue to be debated. Scholars note that the program straddled the line between benevolent intervention and exploitative labor redistribution. By prioritizing rural labor needs alongside child welfare, the program inadvertently commodified vulnerable children, exposing them to variable standards of care. These tensions have informed modern child welfare policies, emphasizing the importance of legal oversight, protection of individual rights, and consideration of the psychological well-being of children. Recognition and remembrance of the orphan train movement grew steadily in the late 20th century. Former riders organized reunions, memoirs were published, and oral histories were recorded. The National Orphan Train Historical Society and institutions such as the National Orphan Train Museum in Concordia, Kansas, curate artifacts, photographs, and personal accounts, preserving both tangible and intangible legacies. These efforts allow contemporary audiences to connect with the human dimension of this historical program, moving beyond statistics to individual lives and experiences. The cultural imprint of the orphan trains extends to literature, film, and scholarship. Documentaries and novels depict the experiences of children navigating the tension between opportunity and loss, illuminating the broader themes of displacement, resilience, and adaptation. Comparative studies also situate the orphan trains within international practices, such as Canada's Home Children program, highlighting the global dimensions of child relocation initiatives and the recurring ethical dilemmas they present. Lessons from the orphan train movement remain relevant. Modern social services emphasize thorough screening of foster families, monitoring of child welfare, and attention to emotional and psychological needs. Policies now reflect awareness that relocation, even with the best intentions, can carry profound consequences for a child's development and identity. The movement serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating both the potential and the limitations of large-scale social interventions. In reflecting on the orphan train legacy, historians, descendants, and social scientists converge on a complex understanding. The program saved lives, fostered opportunity, and built communities, yet it also produced trauma, displacement, and ethical quandaries. It demonstrates the enduring tension between societal good and individual welfare, highlighting the responsibilities inherent in any effort to intervene in vulnerable lives. Ultimately, the orphan trains occupy a unique place in American history. They reveal the intersections of poverty, urbanization, immigration, labor, and social reform. They illuminate the resilience of children confronted with adversity and the moral ambitions of a society attempting to reconcile humanitarian goals with economic and practical realities. The voices of the past, preserved through memoirs, interviews, letters, and museums, ensure that the stories of these children continue to inform, caution, and inspire. The orphan trains were more than transportation. They were conduits of history, carrying with them the hopes, fears, and futures of countless children. They remind us that social reform is inseparable from ethical responsibility, and that the lives of the most vulnerable offer enduring lessons about compassion, justice, and the costs of progress. In the journey from the streets of New York to the farms of the Midwest, the trains carried not only children, but also the complexities, contradictions, and conscience of a nation in transformation.